Welcome to our deep dive on regenerative gardening. You sent over some fascinating excerpts from regengardening.pdf by John Moore. And wow, I have to say I'm already pretty intrigued by this whole idea. Gardening that's less about fighting nature and more about working with it. We have an expert joining us today, someone who could really help us break it all down.
It's a pleasure to be here. And yeah, regenerative gardening really is all about shifting our perspective from domination to collaboration.
Okay, so before we get too far, let's just define what we're even talking about here. What is regenerative gardening? Keep hearing about soil health. But is it really that different from just, regular gardening?
It's definitely more than just tossing some compost on there, although that is certainly part of it. The core principle of regenerative gardening is recognizing that soil isn't just dirt. It's this complex living ecosystem. It's teeming with microbes and fungi and worms and countless other organisms. And the healthier that ecosystem is, the more resilient and productive your garden will be.
So it's like we're not just growing plants, we're actually nurturing a whole underground community.
Exactly.
That's pretty wild.
And that's where it diverges from conventional gardening, which often relies on things like chemical fertilizers and pesticides and herbicides. And all those things really disrupt that delicate balance.
It's funny, I was actually reading through the source material. And there's this whole section on how regenerative gardening can actually help combat climate change. Now, I have to admit, my initial thought was, how can a little backyard garden possibly make a dent in a global problem like that?
It's a very fair question. And the answer lies in something called carbon sequestration. So healthy soil acts as a massive carbon sink. It pulls carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and stores it in the form of organic matter. So by building soil health, we're essentially increasing the Earth's capacity to store carbon, which can have a really significant impact on mitigating climate change.
Wow, that's amazing. So it's not just about growing better tomatoes, it's about contributing to a healthier planet overall. That definitely changes the game for me. Now, one of the things that really caught my eye in the source was this concept of no-dig gardening. And I have to confess, I'm a bit skeptical. I mean, every gardener I know swears by tilling their soil every spring. Are we really supposed to just leave it alone? What does that even look like in practice?
I understand the hesitation. It definitely seems counterintuitive at first, but the logic behind it is pretty simple. Nature doesn't use a rototiller. Forests, meadows, prairies, they all thrive without any human intervention in the soil structure. So no-dig gardening is about mimicking those natural processes.
So instead of churning everything up, we're letting nature build its own, its own intricate underground network.
Yeah.
But doesn't that mean the soil will get compacted? And what about weeds? I can already picture them taking over.
Those are valid concerns. And we can certainly dive into the specifics of no-dig techniques a little later on. But the key takeaway here is that by minimizing disturbance, we're allowing the soil's natural layers, that intricate web of life, to just develop undisturbed. And that leads to better water retention, improved nutrient cycling, and yes, even less work for the gardener in the long run.
Less work, huh? Okay, you've got my attention. Now, the source material also mentioned this fascinating Japanese farmer and philosopher, Masanobu Fukuoka. He's the author of The One Straw Revolution, a book that seems to be pretty influential in the regenerative gardening world. Can you tell us a bit more about him and how his work connects to all of this?
Fukuoka was a true visionary. He essentially turned conventional agriculture on its head. By advocating for a more hands-off approach, what he called do-nothing farming, his philosophy was all about observing natural cycles, minimizing human intervention, and allowing nature to guide the process.
That's such a radical idea, and it sounds a lot like what we're talking about with no-dig gardening, just letting go of control and trusting nature to do its thing.
Exactly. And Fukuoka's work wasn't just theoretical. He actually put it into practice with his own rice farming. There's this famous story about how he experimented with scattering rice straw randomly over his fields instead of neatly arranging it. What he discovered was that the seemingly messy approach actually allowed other crops to thrive amongst the rice, creating a more diverse and resilient ecosystem.
Wait, so a messier garden is actually a better garden? My inner neat freak is having a minor panic attack right now.
It's not about being messy for the sake of messiness, but about recognizing that nature doesn't operate in neat rows and perfect squares. By embracing a bit of that natural chaos, we create a more harmonious environment for plants to flourish.
So it's about working with nature's rhythms, not trying to force it into some artificial order. This is really making me rethink everything I thought I knew about gardening. So we're focusing on soil health, minimizing digging, and embracing a bit of organized chaos in our gardens. But what about the plants themselves? Are there specific types that are particularly beneficial in a regenerative system?
That's a great question, and one we should definitely explore further. But before we jump into the specifics of plants, there is another crucial element of the regenerative gardening puzzle that I think we should address: the fascinating world of soil biology.
Oh, right. The source material did mention something about worm farms. And I have to admit, I'm kind of curious, but also a bit intimidated by the whole idea.
Mm-hmm.
What's so special about worms? And are they really necessary for a thriving garden?
Worms are like the unsung heroes of the soil world. They play a vital role in breaking down organic matter, creating these nutrient-rich castings that act as a natural fertilizer. Plus, their tunnels aerate the soil, improving drainage and root growth.
So are worm farms really as complicated as they sound?
Not at all, actually. We can get into the nitty-gritty of worm composting a bit later. But first, let's talk about why those tiny creatures are so important for building a truly regenerative garden.
Okay, I'm all ears. Tell me everything. And listeners, be sure to join us for part 2 of this deep dive, where we'll delve deeper into the wonders of worm composting and explore the fascinating world of plant selection for a regenerative garden.
Welcome back to our deep dive into regenerative gardening. Before we left off, we were just starting to talk about the amazing world of soil biology and the crucial role that worms play in building a healthy, thriving garden.
Right. I'm still a bit squeamish about the whole worm composting thing, but you've definitely piqued my curiosity. Tell me more about why those little wrigglers are so important.
Well, think of worms as nature's master recyclers. They take all that organic matter, fallen leaves, kitchen scraps, even cardboard, and they transform it into these nutrient-rich castings that are essentially pure gold for your plants.
Yeah, like tiny composting machines.
Oh,
Churning out fertilizer right there in my garden.
that's a great way to put it. And it's not just about the castings. As worms tunnel through the soil, they aerate it, improving drainage and creating pathways for roots to grow. They're also constantly mixing and churning the soil, which helps distribute nutrients and create a more homogeneous structure.
So it's like having a whole team of underground gardeners working for you 24/7. Okay, you've convinced me. I'm ready to embrace the worms. But do I really need a fancy worm farm setup?
Yeah.
Can't I just toss my kitchen scraps in the compost pile and let nature take its course?
You certainly can do that. A traditional compost pile is a great way to recycle organic matter and build healthy soil. But worm composting or vermicomposting offer some unique advantages. Worms are able to break down organic matter much more quickly and efficiently than a standard compost pile. And they produce those highly prized worm castings that are packed with nutrients and beneficial microbes.
So it's like composting on steroids.
You could say that. And setting up a worm farm is surprisingly easy. You can buy a ready-made worm bin or even just use a simple plastic tub.
Okay. I'm starting to warm up to the idea. But before we get too deep into worm farming, I want to circle back to something you mentioned earlier about plant selection. You said perennials are a key element of regenerative gardens. What's so special about them?
Unlike annuals, which complete their life cycle in a single season, perennials live for multiple years, some even for decades. This means their root systems have time to grow, deep and strong, improving soil structure and stability over time. Those deep roots also help tap into nutrients and water sources that shallower-rooted annuals can't reach.
So in a way, they're like the anchors of a regenerative garden, building that long-term soil health and stability.
Exactly. And because they don't need to be replanted every year, they require less disturbance to the soil, which aligns perfectly with that no-dig principle we discussed earlier.
That makes a lot of sense. And I'm guessing perennials also provide habitat and food sources for beneficial insects and pollinators. We talked earlier about how important those creatures are for a healthy ecosystem.
Absolutely. By incorporating a diversity of flowering perennials that bloom throughout the season, we can create a welcoming haven for bees and butterflies and other pollinators, providing them with the nectar and pollen they need to thrive.
So it's about creating a win-win situation for both the plants and the pollinators. Now, this is all starting to paint a really beautiful picture of what a regenerative garden can look like. But I'm also realizing that it requires a pretty significant shift in mindset. It's not just about following a set of rules. It's about understanding the underlying principles and adapting them to your own unique situation.
You've hit the nail on the head. Regenerative gardening is more of a philosophy than a rigid set of rules. It's about embracing those core principles: soil health, minimal disturbance, diversity, and working in harmony with nature, and then applying them in a way that makes sense for your specific climate and soil type and gardening goals.
So it's about being observant, being adaptable, and maybe even being a little bit experimental.
Exactly. And that's where the real fun begins. It's about getting curious, trying new things, and constantly learning from your successes and even your failures, because even those so-called failures are valuable learning opportunities that can help you fine-tune your approach and deepen your understanding of how your garden ecosystem works.
It sounds like a journey of constant discovery, and it's definitely making me question some of my long-held gardening beliefs. Like I've always been meticulous about weeding, convinced that any plant that wasn't intentionally planted was the enemy. But now I'm wondering if maybe I need to rethink my approach to those weeds. Maybe some of them are actually beneficial.
That's a great point, and one we'll explore further after the break, when we delve into practical steps you can take to start your own regenerative gardening journey.
Welcome back to our deep dive into regenerative gardening. Before the break, we were talking about, questioning some of our long-held beliefs about weeding, and maybe it's time to kind of embrace a more nuanced perspective on those plants that we often just label as weeds.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. We've been so conditioned to see anything that's not intentionally planted as the enemy. But in a regenerative system, we really try to shift our mindset from eradication to management.
So instead of waging war on every weed in sight, we take a step back and we just observe.
Exactly. Ask yourself, what role is this plant playing in my garden ecosystem? You might be surprised to find that some weeds actually provide benefits.
For example, I've read that dandelions are great for attracting pollinators, and their deep taproots help break up compacted soil.
That's right. Other weeds might act as living mulch, suppressing the growth of more aggressive species, or they might be nitrogen fixers, naturally enriching the soil.
So it's all about finding that balance right, allowing some weeds to coexist, while managing those that become truly problematic.
Precisely. It's about understanding that every plant has a role to play, even those we haven't intentionally invited into our gardens.
This is really making me rethink my whole approach to gardening. It's so much more complex and interconnected than I ever realized.
And that's the beauty of it. Regenerative gardening is a constant journey of discovery. And as you delve deeper, you start to see the intricate web of relationships that exist within a garden ecosystem.
So where do we even begin? For those of us who are, eager to embark on our own regenerative gardening adventures, what are some practical steps we could take?
Well, the first step is observation. Take some time to really get to know your garden. Observe the soil, the plants, the insects, and the overall patterns and cycles.
And speaking of soil, we talked earlier about minimizing disturbance. What are some no-dig methods that beginners can try?
Sheet mulching is a great option. It involves layering cardboard and organic matter directly on top of the existing vegetation, creating a fertile base for planting without tilling the soil.
That sounds pretty straightforward. And what about choosing plants? Any tips for selecting the right ones for a regenerative garden?
Diversity is key. Aim for a mix of perennials, annuals, and even some native plants that are adapted to your local climate.
And we should also consider the needs of pollinators, right? Make sure we have a variety of flowering plants that bloom throughout the season.
Absolutely. Pollinators are essential for a healthy garden ecosystem, so be sure to provide them with plenty of food and habitat.
This has been such an eye-opening conversation. I feel like I'm seeing my garden and the whole world in a completely new light.
It's been a pleasure sharing this journey with you. Remember, regenerative gardening is a practice of continuous learning and adaptation. Be patient, be curious, and above all, trust in the wisdom of nature.
Wise words. And for all you listeners out there, we encourage you to kind of embrace the transformative power of regenerative gardening. Start small, observe, experiment, and enjoy the abundance and resilience that a thriving garden ecosystem can bring. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into regenerative gardening.
This has been a JM Podcasting Services production. Link in the show notes.